That's a recording.
You want to go up the stairs?
That's not a
Alan, you want to go up the stairs?
I'm good.
It's much safer.
Oh, well.
Okay, I want to welcome you
Safety's not my
to our little
specialty.
down-home music event here with the celebrity, two celebrities here. Our MC and moderator is, of course, Joel Selvin, who I'm sure most of you knew from when he was working for the Chronicle and all these good things he's done since then. And in the middle is the man who really put this book together, and his name is Alan Govenar, and I'm Chris Strachwitz, and I had the great pleasure of meeting both these gentlemen that helped produce this book, that created it actually, I mean at least the content of it. And that was in 1960, when I happened to be in Houston for the second time. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that once we get started here. Mm-hmm. And I was lucky enough to learn a lot from both those Paul Oliver and Mack McCormick. If I hadn't met those two, I don't think I would have known much about Texas at all.
Well, I'm glad to be here. This is a great pleasure. Strachwitz, of course, is the most highly esteemed colleague of mine I can think of. And Alan, I know through his work both as pretty much the premier expert on Texas blues, who's published a number of, foundational books on the subject. But then I also tripped across his other major field of endeavor when I was working on a book with the tattoo artist Ed Hardy. It turns out that Alan is one of the great academic experts on tattooing in this country, and in addition to his work as a writer and a photographer and a playwright even, he's an accomplished filmmaker whose latest movie got 2 thumbs up from Ed Hardy himself. It's called Tattoo Uprising. It's opening pretty soon.
Well, it opened on Friday. It's running through Thursday at the Roxy.
There you go. So we plugged the new movie. But it's great to see all you guys here. This is fantastic because I assume like this, you guys aren't here by accident. and we all share an avid interest in arcane American music. So tonight's the night, this is the place, these are the guys.
I think it's the Blues Mafia West.
Yeah, I told Chris, the Blues Mafia heard that they put a hit out on him. So here we are. And this book is just amazing. I don't know if you had a chance to see it or not. It's just as dense and monumental as a book that has the legend and reputation that this has had underground for many, many years. And what I love especially is I love a book that has a story about it that's as good as the story in it. And so I'm really interested to hear what Alan says when I ask him this now, because I don't know the answer to this question, but do tell us how you rescued this manuscript and how this book finally came to be published.
I started getting interested in Texas blues in the early 1970s when I was a student at Ohio State. And one of the first books I read on blues was Paul Oliver's book, The Meaning of the Blues. It had originally been published as Blues Fell This Morning. And I marveled at Paul's text, and it was a reference guide to recordings of music that I wanted to hear. And so I was in the middle of a folklore class and got to hear all these amazing blues recordings. My introduction to blues and jazz, though, came as a child. When I was 4 years old, my father came home with a portable record player, and one of the records was 12 top hits of 1956, and another was one of these victory records that was Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Sarah Vaughan, and so I loved the sound, but I didn't know that much about the music. So as time went on, I became more and more interested in it, and I ended up going to graduate school in Austin to get a master's degree in folklore. And while I was in Austin, I got to hear Lightnin' Hopkins for the first time. I got to hear Mance Lipscomb live. These performers just captivated me. And the other person I met during that period, but didn't know well, was Les Blank, because his films were often screening at Soap Creek Saloon, and Les was often in Austin. So the years went by, and I went back to Ohio, where I'd gone as an undergraduate. I'm originally from the inner city of Boston, but I went back to Ohio. I taught part-time at Ohio State and at the Columbus College of Art and Design, and then eventually found my way to Dallas. And I was teaching at a professional art college, and I got my first NEA grant to make a film on tattooing, which the arts faculty was not very excited about. And the college agreed to be the fiscal agent for the grant so long as they said I could never give them a credit in the final film, which spoke volumes to me about the need to leave. And I had a friend who was starting this graduate program in Texas. And so I went down to Texas, and I was part of that whole first generation of public folklorists. I had been organizing folk festivals in Columbus, Ohio. I worked with Tim Lloyd and others we were all getting started in this together. And when I came to Dallas, I was, once again, got out my book, Meeting the Blues, and started, wanting to know more about that, and read about Alex Moore, and became aware of Arhoolie records. I mean, I had known about Arhoolie early on as well, but not that much. And I started to realize that there was not much written about Texas blues for whatever reason, and I didn't quite understand that. So in 1984, when I finished my doctorate at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I used to go to these little Friday afternoon get-togethers of artists and writers at a place called the Idle Rich, which was a bar behind City Hall in Dallas. And someone presented me the idea and said, "You got to do something on Texas blues." And so I got started on that idea, and it ended up getting a major commission from the Dallas Museum of Art to do a project called Living Texas Blues. It was a small book, it was an anthology cassette, and 3 short films. And in the process of doing that, I reached out to Mr. Chris Strachwitz at Arhoolie because I wanted recommendations. And then I wanted to track down Mack McCormick, who had done all this kind of amazing work in Texas, but had never been published. And then I came out to California and was doing things on Texas blues as it came to Oakland and the East Bay. And there was a huge Texas component here. I met with Lee Hildebrandt and others who were doing this work out here in the Bay Area. And Les and I went to this place, Eli's Mile High Club. And we heard Sonny Rhodes, who I had just interviewed earlier in the day. And it was this crazy scene with this German woman dancing, smoking a cigarette while Sonny Rhodes was singing this song, Cigarette Blues. And it was like, this is amazing. I went back to Dallas, talked to the curator I was working with, and the Dallas Museum of Art actually gave me the money to come back. So I came back, and Les and I were going to shoot this film, and I needed someone to do sound. And I remember coming down here and saying, "Chris, I called you, we've talked on the phone. Would you be willing to do sound?" And he was like, "Mouse music. I'm not doing this." And, finally we talked, and he agreed to go with us over to Eli's and did sound. And Les and I made a wonderful little movie called Cigarette Blues, which screened extensively in the 1980s. So after finishing the Living Texas Blues book, I got the idea to do a book called Meeting the Blues. And after talking with Mac, who wasn't particularly friendly to me and wasn't particularly gracious, or didn't really share much, he was very much guarded about what he knew, I decided to focus on the period that I knew that he and Paul had not covered, which was the influence of T-Bone Walker and how blues music and rhythm and blues evolved to help create the contemporary blues sound. So I did that book, and I did another book called The Early Years of Rhythm and Blues that focused on the Duke Peacock era in Houston, and it just kept spiraling forward. And finally, in the mid-1990s, I was invited by Michel Fabre, who was a professor at the Sorbonne, and he had devoted his life and career to writing about African-American expatriates in France. And he asked me to be part of this conference on African-American music and dance in Europe, and said I could organize an all-conference panel. And so I brought John Jackson, and instead of having him play guitar, he played banjo at this conference. And there was a French psychoanalyst, so I'd gotten to know, Francis Hofstein, and he was part of the panel. And in the audience was Paul Oliver. And I was just, wow, I finally get to meet Paul Oliver. And I talked to him, and my wife, Kalita Doolin, who's here tonight, was back at the hotel watching our son. And I called, I said, I really, let's get together with Paul and his wife, Val. And we had lunch with them, and we talked all afternoon. It became dinner. The next year, we went to visit them in Oxford, and it just went on from there. I ended up doing other blues books. I did this rather esoteric release that would never have been issued on the Arhoolie label called Hallelujah Jubilee, Black East Texas Harmonica Players and Their Songs. And it was 55 tracks on a CD, and they were tunes. And Paul thought, this is really important. And he wrote the wonderful notes for this. And so we got to know each other, and then he wrote the foreword to a book of mine called Texas Blues, The Rise of a Contemporary Sound. And then, by then, Paul was getting up in years, and he was trying to pull all his papers together. And he said to me, would you help me finish this book that I started in 1959 with Mack McCormick? And I was like, wow, this is, everything in the buzz, the oral buzz about this book was that it was the holy grail of blues books. This was, everything you ever needed and wanted to know about the roots of Texas blues. And, it kind of concerned me because I'd been spending, the last decade and a half writing about a subject that I knew I could have probably learned more had this book been published. But the more Paul and I got into it, I realized that it was going to be very difficult to finish this book. But I was game if he was, and he came to Texas, and we kind of worked through some ideas, and then it was the 50th anniversary of the founding of Arhoolie. And the last time I was really at Down Home Music was when I moderated a discussion between Paul and Chris talking about their experiences in Texas in their journey around to record blues in 1960. Well, as Paul's health began to decline, I was concerned about this manuscript because while I believed Paul that he was the author of the written manuscript that contained huge amounts of research from Mack, and in that sense they were co-authors, I realized that this was going to be tough. Mack was not cooperative. When Paul came to Texas, I tried to reunite him with Mack. I thought, wouldn't that be wonderful that they could get together? I worked with Roger Wood, who was writing about Houston blues and who was seeing, he was having dinner every week with Mack McCormick. Well, Mack just wouldn't budge. And they had obviously had a huge impasse. I mean, they started work on this book in 1959. By the mid-1970s, they had a falling out. Paul told me that he had sent Mack the original typed manuscript. It was over 800 pages, single-spaced, and sent him the first carbon copy. And all he kept for himself was the third carbon copy, which was on onion skin kind of paper. And Mack never responded. So there had been this 40-year period where the whole manuscript lay fallow. Paul, of course, continued to write books on blues, but he was one that he wanted to see come to fruition. So finally, I was able to figure out a legal structure with the help of my attorney of how this could happen. And because they were co-authors, I don't know that no one could produce a written agreement that was ever signed between them, that they each had the right to license the manuscript to someone else. So Paul licensed it to me and to him, and then gave me the survivorship rights. Well, Paul realized I needed to see it. No one had ever seen this. So his cousin, Dougie Melsom, in New Zealand, who was very close to Paul and his wife Val, came to Oxford, and they boxed up the manuscript. I mean, in letters and emails that I got from Val, she said Paul was really kind of concerned because everything looked messy. He wanted to trim the pages. He needed to hand number them. And then there were thousands of pages of letters and notes that he had kept over the years. And so these boxes, he sends them at Christmas time, the worst of all possible times, and they get lost. They get held up in Canada. And it's like he's really in a panic. Finally, they show up in Dallas. And I start going through this material, and it is just kind of mind-boggling, what's there and how thorough. But yet, at the same time, it was clear that it was unfinished. And there were all these cryptic notes. And so throughout the manuscript, it'd be like note 463, QRW, page 3, ZX, page 4. What did this mean? So finally, I realized in going through it, there were 3,000 pages of letters and notes that they were somehow alluding to. It was a great puzzle. So I realized, there's parts of this that are missing. I need to find the documentation for this. The other thing that needed to be done was it had to be typed. It had to be put into word processing form so that you could really search it and do something with it. And there was a woman that was working for Kalita and I. Kalita and I founded the Texas African American Photography Archive, and she was involved in processing a lot of those materials, and she got reassigned to this, and it took her 7 months to go through this onion skin, single-spaced manuscript to make it happen. And we got a grant from the Arhoolie Foundation that really helped things along. And after getting it typed, Kalita and I, we were in Europe, and there was a film of mine called The Beat Hotel that had its premiere at the Danish Film Institute in Copenhagen. And we flew to London and took the Oxford Tube bus up. It was the end of November, beginning of December. It was freezing cold. We get to Paul's house, and it's clear that Paul is really not doing well. He hadn't turned the heat on in his house. He was sitting in a room with a space heater, and the rest of the house was freezing. And so Michael Roach, who is an African-American blues singer, was helping him a lot. And Michael was there, and Michael took me up in the attic, and the attic was freezing cold, and papers everywhere. And finally, Paul got impatient, and he dragged Kalita up to the attic, where I was scouring through everything. And finally, this red, moldy Samsonite suitcase. And, I kind of pry it open. It's apocryphal. And there were all the missing notes, the documentation for this manuscript. And so Paul, said, yeah, you can take it. And he gave me some of the photographs that he had done in relationship to the book. And Michael Roach, because it was boxes of stuff, many more thousands of pages of stuff to bring back to Dallas. And we brought it to our friend Roger Armstrong. We were staying with Roger, who's one of the owner-founders of Ace Records, and got shipped to Dallas. Well, as it progressed further, it was clear that Paul was declining. His short-term memory was shot. He still basically remembered the manuscript because long-term memory sticks around longer. But then, in talking with Michael, it was clear that Paul had early and progressing quickly Alzheimer's dementia. And Paul, I think, was one of the most charming and engaging people I'd ever met. And whenever I'd call him, he'd be real cheery to hear about the book. And then I'd call him an hour later, and he'd forget that I called him an hour earlier. And so we talked, I just really didn't know what to do. There was no way on earth I was going to finish this book. And I started talking to Paul about the idea that this should be published as a historical artifact. And because people should see the thought process that went on between these two men, and to know about the correspondence and everything that had transpired between them.
Tell them to call back, Chris.
That was probably Paul calling and saying that I got something wrong.
Hello, heaven.
But in any case, Paul was still sentient, his memory was going, and he agreed to that idea. And Michael Roach liked the idea too. So I needed help. And I approached Kip Lornell, who I'm sure many of you are aware of, who has written a number of books on his own on vernacular music. He was the biographer with Charles Wolfe of the biography of Leadbelly. And I talked to Kip about doing it. Said I had this small grant from the Arhoolie Foundation and we can bring you to Texas. Well, we worked on it for the next 4 years, and if we were paying ourselves, it would have equaled 5 to 10 cents an hour. But it was worth it because we just marveled at what was there. And Kip, he's a scholar of great magnitude, and he was really helpful to identify sources because Paul had an extensive library. He had collected all kinds of books that you couldn't even find in libraries. And we were being able to kind of match it. And John Cowley, another British blues historian, offered some suggestions, and we talked to Tony Russell and other people that we could find who were part of this drama and this epic journey. And finally, after about 4 more years, we were able to finish it as a manuscript. And so the book is compiled by me with essays by one I wrote, which is the story of the book, and an essay that Kip and I co-authored that hopes and tries to situate this work as the pioneering work of blues scholarship. So that's the story of how the book came to be. And it's kind of the story of my life at the same time. And when I finally sent it to Chris, he said it's probably going to take the rest of his life to read it. And I said...
I'm a slow reader, that's true.
And I said, no, Chris, we want you around for a long time. And he said, don't worry, it's going to take a very long time to read this.
Chris, why don't you tell us about who Mack McCormick and Paul Oliver were? You knew them both so well.
Okay, well, I guess I should start with the fact that I met Sam Charters here at UC Berkeley. I was probably in 1953 when I transferred from Pomona up to UC Berkeley. I was already a total blues fan, and Lightning Hopkins was my prime hero, so to speak. And Sam Charters was just writing his first book on blues, which was actually the first book on blues, the Country Blues it was called. And he had trunks full of old records, by Blind Lemon and all these early things. I didn't really like them. They sounded so tinny compared to Sonny Boy Williams and Howling Wolf and Lightning Hopkins. And however, after, it was in 1959, I was already starting to teach high school down in Los Gatos, and I got a postcard from Sam Charters from Houston saying, oh yeah, I got to mention that I had nothing but Lightning Hopkins records. I mean, mostly. I had a ton of them already. And Sam was sort of interested in them. He was at first reluctant because, he was, like most of the early blues scholars, more interested in Blind Lemon, who I simply couldn't stand to listen to because it was so damn tinny. And so So I got this postcard saying, I found Lightning Hopkins. He lives here in Houston, Texas. And a guy named Mack McCormick is trying to be his agent. And he gave me the address from Mack. And so in 1959, when I was still teaching high school, I took a pilgrimage, literally, to Houston, Texas on a bus. And I met Lightning Hopkins because I first met Mack McCormick. He greeted me down there. I was staying at the YMCA, I guess. And I didn't have a pot to pee in, but I made it down there. And Lightning invited us to come and hear him play that night at a little beer joint. And of course, some of you may have heard my little story, but I was totally knocked out by how he performed in this little beer joint with just about maybe a quarter of the people that are in here. Yet he was ferociously singing away with his electric guitar and a drummer behind him. And he was singing about how his arthritis was bothering him, how he could hardly get to the gig that night, how the water was covering the chuck holes and his car couldn't see the holes. And then all of a sudden he pointed at me as we came in, whoa, man, this man come all the way from California to hear poor Lightning sing. I don't think he'd ever met a white man or anybody who kind of took a pilgrimage to hear him. The other white guys that he all met, they all wanted to capture his music or record him, like Sam Charters did, you know, and as Mack McCormick also did. Mack McCormick was already a member of the Houston Folklore Society, and they studied, you know, very academically. I was strictly a fan. I thought this is just amazing, amazing music. And so whatever you hear on his records are just 2.5 or 3 minutes of snapshots, what came out of his mouth at the time. He would improvise a lot of lyrics. And when I started reading this amazing book, I realized that the early songsters, who were like Mance Lipscomb, but who even preceded him, they were valued most highly if they were improvisers to their immediate audience in the plaza or on the street corner, wherever they were performing. It wasn't this set pattern. Okay, you got to hear this, and this is the kind of song that's on a record, you see. And I'll never forget when Mance Lipscomb told me about this. I asked him, you know, how did you learn some of these songs? And he mentioned one way, he said, if a carnival came through town, there would always be a singer of some kind, whether blues or country, whatever it was, and they would have a new song that people in Navasota, where he lived, had never heard before. And he would catch it in his ears. He was just amazing. That's something that amazes me about a lot of songsters or people who really make a living or love music. It just gets to them like osmosis almost. And he said, Chris, that next weekend when I played at parties or little dances, house dances, that's all the people wanted to hear, that song. And I had to play it over and over. I played it slow, I played it fast, and I played it again and again the whole night long, because there was no record of it. You see, it was something, but they all liked it. It was just an amazing thing that I learned from that book, amongst many other things. Well, so I got to know Mack McCormick pretty well, because I went back the next year and tried to record Lightning, but by that time he was actually on his way to California to play at a folk festival here. And so I never succeeded in recording him live in a beer joint, and that period in his life was over with at that time, because, you know, he became a standard folk singer, so to speak, almost, in a totally different world. And I always remember when Elijah Wall told me, you know, Chris, there will never be another Lightning Hopkins, because there will never be another person that comes from the same area, that heard the same kind of music that he grew up with, that had the same rural experience that he grew up with, that will never be again. And that really hit me. You know, I always thought that the music I liked, that would be there for a while. At least I thought it would be for a long time, but that didn't happen. Music changes so quickly. And I remember asking Alan Lomax once, you know, how come black music changes so fast? He says, Chris, as soon as African Americans start a new kind of music, the white folks steal it from them. I mean, it's a kind of music that they feel comfortable communicating with each other with. The white folks take it on and make it theirs too, and then they have to invent something new. And that's still going on. Well, anyway, so I got to know Mack McCormick in 1959, and he was the most knowledgeable person I could have possibly ever in my life run into in regard to how Texas functioned. Not just the music. He knew all the different sections of Houston, where certain African Americans were from the piney woods, where some of them came from different areas, how the French-speaking Creoles came from Louisiana and which part of Houston they were in, and all of that. And I remember in that first year I was there, Mack took me to a Zydeco contest actually on Dowling, just off of Dowling Street. And that's where, that was in 1960, yeah, that was in 1960, because by that time I had a crummy tape recorder, but it worked for a while. It was a Japanese copy of an Ampex, but they left the good parts out of it. And after 1 year, it totally overmodulated everything. Anyway, but I had never heard such music. And then in 63, well, anyway, I got to really know Mack, and then in 60, we also, since Lightning was going to California, Mack simply asked me, Chris, I'm sure there's a lot of people like Lightning, because he didn't really like Lightning that much. He thought he was sort of a shuck and jive artist. To me, he was just this personal guru almost, you know, who could express himself in a way that just sounded fantastic to my ears. And who had a certain guitar style. It's like what I like in norteño music. It may be very ordinary and very repetitive to some people, but he always improvised something along the line, you know, it's just, anyway. And anyway, I became totally enamored by the whole thing, but I was strictly a fan. So we went to we went on the highway. He said, there must be people like Lightning out here, you know. So he took me out on the highway towards Navasota, which is on northwest of Houston. And we had become sort of detectives by then. And I'll never forget, as we were driving on the highway towards Navasota, I saw some people either chopping, you know, which means they were weeding, you know, in this field. I don't know what the heck was growing there. But I went up to the fence, and of course they came, and they were two African-American people, and they came, what you all looking for? And I said, would you know of any guitar pickers in these parts? And he said, oh, you got to go to Navasota for that. And so we were actually on our way to Navasota, and when we got to Navasota, Mack, in his knowledge of everything Texan, said, Chris, the people who actually know everybody in a small town like that would be a feed store. So we stopped at the first feed store we came to. And Mack, he had a gruff way of speaking. I mean, he could pass as a policeman or as a CIA agent. He said, does Tom Moore by any chance live in this town? And he said, yes, Mr. Moore sure does. Mr. Moore, not just Tom Moore, so trying to put us in our place. And then Mack asked, well, how can I reach him? There's a telephone right there. And so Mack actually called Tom Moore. I don't know how many of you have heard that early Gold Star record by Lightning Hopkins about Tim Moore's farm. There's only a couple of 3 or 4 people, yeah. He sings this ferocious, really protest song, especially on the first recording he made of it. He said, "There ain't but the one thing this black man done wrong, but move his wife and family on Mr. Tom Moore's farm. If you ask Mr. Moore for $5, he'll haul off and give you 10. That's to keep you further in debt, actually. But he also had some good verses. He said, if your woman ever leaves you, tell Mr. Moore and he'll have her brought right back. Because he wanted his laborers, you see. I mean, it's an amazing ballad. It really is a total ballad. And people made up different verses. And unfortunately, I sent my first versions of it to Mack, who, of course, I didn't copy things in those days. And so it's in some place in his archives is this tape of by Marcellus Thomas, who lived out here in Oakland, but who grew up in that area and who knew that song. Anyway, I think I better just shut up and see if we can get some other.
Well, I wanted you to introduce Mac and Paul.
Oh, Paul, yes.
Yeah, that's
okay. That was the other stroke of luck. I mean, I had corresponded with Paul because I was a record collector, as so many of us, and I heard that he was really, very interested in all these things. And I'll never forget, in the year before I went down there in a car with a tape machine in 1960, he wrote to me and sent me a long list of people who made recordings in Fort Worth and Dallas, because he knew Bob Pinson, who I was driving with to come down to Houston. We were going to stop in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. And amongst all the names, I remember there was a Black Ace. I thought that's an amazing name to have. Anyway, I try to remember one or two names that were in that thing, you see, in Paul's letter. And when I went up to people who were playing cards on the sidewalk, a bunch of black folks, and I went up to them, and I had a 78 by a guy named Little Brother that was on a Dallas label, yeah, I think on Talent Records. And I asked, and one of them came up to me and said, what you want? And I said, do you know where this guy, Little Brother, might be? And he said, yeah, he hangs out with Black Ace. And I said, oh my God. And that name just hit me like a lightning rod, Oh, where can I meet Black Ace? Go to this tavern right down the street, and every evening at 5 o'clock, he'll come in there, he'll wear a white shirt, he has Ace written on it. And I got to that tavern, and there was Black Ace. And, he was a wonderful guy, and he played a dobro steel guitar. And we talked him into getting his guitar back in shape. He didn't have any strings on it. But anyway, so that's how that started. And then I forgot all about that Little Brother guy. And, and so when I met with Paul we made a deal to meet in Memphis at the Peabody Hotel, which is where many of the early recordings were made in the late 20s. And he had gotten this amazing support that really impressed me. I didn't really know anything about it at the time. He was supported by the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Corporation, and he had actually received a portable, very compact little tape recorder I was totally impressed with. And he was sent over here to really document the lives and histories of African American, especially blues performers. But he got interested, and he had met so many interesting people in France, and he'd met various very literary people. By the way, Paul Oliver's real specialty in life was vernacular architecture, and he was well known all over the world for that. Blues were just a hobby of his, but he had this amazing, amazing head that knew so much about everything. And I only wish I had been more hip to his incredible knowledge, because, I focused in very narrowly on blues or people that I was impressed by, because it was really my first experience in not only getting to know Texas rural and urban life and its amazing variety, everything from these French-speaking Creoles that lived in one section. And anyway, Paul became, and he and his wife Valerie were just an amazing, wonderful couple. And they had given, for example, in Clarksdale, Mississippi, he had gotten a letter from somebody to make sure to get together with the NAACP leader in Clarksdale. His name was Aaron Henry. He had a big pharmacy there. And I'll never forget when we went to his house, Dr. Henry, in Clarksdale, he said, well, you pointing at me, you're from Germany, our former enemies, and Paul, you're from Great Britain. You can go any place you want to in this state or in this country. I cannot. I'm an American, but I cannot do that. That really hit me. I mean, I was knowledgeable about, it wasn't exactly total segregation, integration or segregation out here, but blacks were primarily living in North Richmond or in West Oakland. They were definitely in certain areas, but I wasn't really knowledgeable about how ethnic groups, functioned in this country at that time. That took me a long time to realize, and the amazing variety of religions. See, where I came from in Germany, we only had two religions. You were either Protestant or Catholic. And I'll tell you a weird story about that, because our family was Catholic, but most of the village was Protestant. And I'll never forget, I was walking with my older sister down the cobblestone road in my village, and here comes a carriage, a coach, one of those wedding coaches that are glass enclosed, black coaches with a horse drawn, with a horse in front of him. But she had a tractor pulling it. This woman that was sitting in there behind the glass, and I asked my sister, oh my God, because a tractor was really rare in our village. We only had one in our huge farm. We did all the work with oxen and things like that. And I asked her, who is that lady? And my sister said, she's a Protestant. She can't go to heaven. I said, oh my God. So I came from a total different world altogether. And it took me a while to get acquainted with this amazingly varied land of extraordinary, not only sounds, but beliefs and customs. And I was totally enamored by that from then on. And Paul seemed to be the kind of person, that had so much in his head already and was willing to share it, although I must have bored him to death sometimes driving across the country, always listening to preachers. They were constantly on the radio, especially in the South. That's all you could get sometimes. Some of them on Sunday mornings were pretty good because he used to have a lot of gospel programs, and so on. But most of the time anyway, I can go on forever. But so I got to know Paul really well, and we came out west together. We drove out here. And yes, he was simply one of the most genteel, knowledgeable persons I've ever encountered in my life. I can go on forever, but I think we might as well.
Well, that sounds like a pair, a knowledgeable, genteel person and a gruff academic.
Well, actually, Mack McCormick was not an academic.
Correct.
That's what was interesting about their collaboration. Mack learned everything on his own. He was a record collector like Chris and Sam Charters and Paul. He liked doing primary research, but he had interactive kinds of jobs. He was a cook, he was a taxi driver, and he was a census taker. So part of the richness of this book results mainly from Mack taking this kind of census taker approach to doing research. So if he went into a little town where Black Boy Shine had lived, he talked to the neighbor, he talked to the barber, he talked to the guy who had the little cafe down the road, the person in the general store, and he put together these composite pictures, men and women, that he would talk to. And he was quite remarkable that way. But the research that was in the book needed to be documented, and a lot of the documentation existed in the letters. Now, there were also interviews that Paul had done. And one of the ones, when he came out to California to see Chris, was one of the great singers of the 1920s, who was what would be called today a kind of city blues singer, who sang at the Ella B. Moore Theater in Dallas on Central Avenue, was Lillian Glynn. And Lillian Glynn had basically been discovered by a preacher who realized that this woman could really sing, but she got into singing blues. And so during the mid-1920s, she made a lot of blues recordings.
Not that many, actually, but a couple.
Yeah, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe, more than that. But she, in any case, her songs are classics. I mean, one of my favorites is Cravin' a Man Blues. And she came to California and went back to the church life. And Paul saw this sign in Oakland that in front of a church, that on one Sunday morning, Lillian Glynn was going to be performing.
Yeah, that was
And he got to interview Lillian Glynn. And through Lillian Glynn, he learned immense amounts of information about the other women singers who were contemporaries. Bobby Cadillac, Bessie Tucker, and these other obscure women who, were probably streetwalkers, but they were women who sang, who were embraced by Ella B. Moore. Ella B. Moore was an amazing woman in herself in that she had the Ella B. Moore Park Theater in Dallas. And she had come with her husband Chintz, they'd come from South Carolina, they were vaudevillians. And both her and her husband ended up founding the TOBA, the Theater Owners Booking Association, which was later called by many black performers Tough on Black Asses, because of the ways in which they were not able to make money on that with the Chitlin circuit with their music.
Yeah.
But Paul took every opportunity he could. The other person who contributed to this book was Chris, and I remember calling Chris and saying, wow, there's this amazing interview you did with Marcellus Thomas in Los Gatos.
So I learned a lot from the two of them, that you really have to dig into things and you're trying to find out where does all this music come from. And so I learned something from them. And you also got to mention that Mack McCormick was really a very frustrated playwright. He had one play that was totally panned. Otherwise, he tried to write others, but he was a frustrated man.
And he was writing plays up to the end. That was what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And when he wrote that first letter to Paul Oliver, it's very striking. It's in the book. He talks about how he, was 29 years old. He was writing plays, and he was completely deferential to Paul. Because Paul had been writing for the British jazz magazine, Music Mirror. And that's where a lot of the information was. And Chris also contributed to those British magazines. And people would find records in the record bins, and then they'd write in and say, I found X, Y, and Z. That's the way Sam Charters was as well. And that was how these discographies began to take shape, because all of this music had basically been dispersed and lost, and the masters didn't really exist. And it was.
But we were we were non-academic, we were total amateurs.
But Mack was decidedly not an academic. And sadly, what happened to Mack was that he became mentally ill. And, as I got to know him more, I became more sympathetic to him in a sense, though he was still as gruff and defensive and kind of aggressive about, the recognition that he thought he deserved but never received. But he was bipolar, and he was never properly medicated. And by the early 1970s, when he had the falling out with Paul, his health was really bad. And finally he got diagnosed, but he's battled being bipolar, manic depressive, for much of his adult life. And so that really impeded his ability to write. In the letters, it's clear that, he was going to provide the research as much as he could, but he was also going, and that Paul was going to write the manuscript, because Paul knew how to write. And as Chris pointed out, Paul had this sweeping understanding of history. So Paul could contextualize it. So you read in the book, not necessarily all the interpretations are completely thought through, but you kind of marvel at Paul's ability to synchronize or syncretize the research that he was doing with the research Mack was doing. There was another couple, John and Marlene Norris in Detroit, who had really studied the Thomas family. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Sippy Wallace. Okay, well, Sippy Wallace, one of the people that Mack interviewed was this woman, Willie Mae Brown. Willie Mae Brown was a Houston piano player who remembered the Thomas family when they were in Houston. They eventually dispersed. But she talked about Mama Thomas, who raised 3 children. 2 of them were girls, Hosiel and Sippy. Sippy's married name was Wallace, and their son George. Well, they were all piano players of great capacity. Then George's son was also a piano player, Arhoolle. The father was a piano player. It was this incredible family. Within one of the areas of the book that is mind-boggling in a way is the number of blues pianists who all played essentially this core repertoire differently. And they were all musicians who identified their style of playing with the train lines that they were near.
Yeah, that's part really got me when I saw that about the piano players, what they call them, the Gulf Coast, or whatever it's called.
Well, the Santa Fe, the Fort Bend piano players, the Dallas Barrel House piano players, then, Sippy Wallace and the Wallace family, Willie Mae Brown said, yeah, they played a lot of blues, but they also played refined music. I'm not sure exactly what refined music was or is, but it was probably more popular novelty songs.
Yeah. And the thing that really got me was towards the end of the 1800s, I think it was, that the first railroad was built between Dallas and Houston. And then, you remember, there were hardly any roads even back in those days. And they started building a railroad westward out of Houston. And apparently that's how pianos got to all those little towns that were already there, or villages you would call them in Europe, They really aren't towns, but everybody's calling everything town or city. And so you could transport pianos on the train. And that's how they all got into taverns and stuff, yeah.
I've thought about that, but I doubt the ones that went into the taverns were the ones that came off the train. I think the ones that came off the train went into the homes of white folks, and the broken down pianos in the homes of white folks went to the little taverns, the little barrel houses.
Well, I'm not sure if there was that distinction in those days. I think a lot of places were very rough little towns, There wasn't that
But
much
pianos were
distinction.
expensive.
Yes, but I mean, a big club or hotel or something could afford one, I think.
Hotels.
Correct.
But you think about these piano players played in brothels. They
Well-
played in barrel houses, beer joints. These were the workers. And there was people playing music for the workers.
Well, you got to read it in the book.
Let's see if there's some questions out in the audience, you guys. What do you think? Any questions we want to?
Well, even those pianos would have come originally off the train, so.
They would have come originally off the train. Though the first piano that came to Dallas, this is just a aside, came in the 1850s. There was a French utopian community that was founded in Dallas called La Réunion. And the first piano in Dallas came by covered wagon. They came up through Galveston, through Houston, up to Dallas. So that was the first piano. Maybe that was the one Alex Moore played.
I mean, it's just extraordinary how these black African musicians, came somehow to see instruments that suited them, and they were just fascinated by them. I don't think many of them had any kind of training.
No, they didn't. But, a
But
lot
they
of
learned
them.
from each other.
They learn from each other. I mean, one of the really, and then we'll open it up a bit to questions, one of the great interviews that Mac did was with Blind Lemon Jefferson's youngest sister, Carrie. And that was, I've written a lot about Blind Lemon, and, was really amazed by the information that came forward in her interview about Blind Lemon's family actually having a piano, that his first instrument was a concertina that his father played. And to think that Blind Lemon actually had access, and guitar came later on for Blind Lemon, according to his sister. And it's just this amazing texture that emerges in terms of who were these performers. One other little detail to bear in mind is that they both Paul and Mac talked about how even though they found, and Mac found, guitarists and blues singers and songsters in just about every little town he went to, he said that that was only 3 to 7% of all the blues players that were out there at that time. So the 93% that are still remembered by someone somewhere.
I mean, everybody could sing. I mean, this is why the field hollers are so important part of you know, because people
Exactly.
at work like to sing, and it doesn't necessarily, again, you can make up verses. Texas Alexander was one of the few real field holler type performers to be recorded. But maybe I should just finish that little thing about Tom Moore. So we went up to his office, actually, over the bank building. And he was very kind, I thought, and received us. And of course, Mack immediately said, well, can we visit your plantation? And he said, well, you know, if you make an appointment, I don't really have time today. But, and then Mack asked him, well, is there any singers around this town that most people seem to enjoy here in Navasota? And he said, yeah, there's a guy that seem to all like. Excuse me. I don't know his name, but you go down the railroad station and you ask Pegleg, he'll know. And so we had no trouble finding Pegleg at the railroad station, and he gave us the name of Mans Lipscomb. And he told us where he lived. And we went to his house, and his wife said, no, he's still out on the highway cutting grass, but come on back in about an hour. So we brought some beer back, and we made that first record that same night in this little house. And he was just an amazing, wonderful person. He's such a gentleman, and besides, wonderful guitar player, and knew a most amazing repertoire. He called himself a songster. He did not call himself a blues singer at all, because he really sang the total repertoire of what the village or town, Navasota, was. Not just black things. I mean, he knew gospel songs and blues, but he actually knew Barbara Allen, I think, pieces of a British ballad, and he knew all kinds of good stuff, you know. It was just extraordinary. And so when we drove back to Houston, that's when Mack McCormick suddenly came up with the idea, because I was thinking about starting a record company with Lightning, sort of, and he suddenly said, I started thinking about Gulf or Delta, you know. I should have thought about Humidity Records or something. But anyway, he suddenly said, how about Arhoolie? I said, what? Well, it hit me though. And I said, how the hell do you spell that? Well, it was A-R-W-H. Yes, there was a W in there.
I think it's spelled out there, right there.
Yeah, well, that's how I spelled it. I cut out a W in there because it was taken from a Library of Congress record where they recorded a black performer in Mississippi, and they asked him apparently afterwards, what's the name of that song you just did? And if you knew Fred McDowell, who was from Mississippi, or other people, when they're a little nervous, they'll start every sentence with Ara, Chris, are we going to go downtown today? Or are we going to... They put an Ara in front of everything. And I think he simply stuttered, that's a Arhoolie, because the word Arhoolie we've heard as being a field holler. Anyway, that's...
So it's been wrong all this time.
Pardon?
So it's been wrong all this time.
No, I don't think, nobody knows how to write these things. This is,
So it's good as an Arhoolie, it's a field house, but really, Arhoolie.
Yeah.
well,
So, questions in the house?
Paul obviously wrote other blues books during and after this. Did any of the material from this book work its way into those books?
Not exactly. Not exactly. I mean, in varying ways it did. I mean, Paul, you know, and I've been the same way on blues books that I've written. I partition what I've done into different areas. And even when I got my hands on this manuscript, which I could have used in other things I was writing, I did not. And I wouldn't let anyone else cherry pick it until it was published, because I felt like it had to have the integrity of what it was. So I think for Paul, he did in different ways. I mean, Paul wrote many books, but they tend to be very focused. He did one on field recording locations. He did, you know, he did his book Story of the Blues, which was, for me personally, a big inspiration and became the kind of aesthetic that I wanted to pursue with my book, Meeting the Blues, and because there were no photographic blues books. And Paul's Story of the Blues set a whole new standard about, you know, visual documentation, record labels, and visual materials, photographs of not only musicians, but of the life in which the blues came from.
But his overall knowledge, too, of the whole culture was always present. And I always remember whenever he was visiting us here, even the first time, he wanted to go to bookstores that had all kinds of old books. And he was always looking for travel stories from the 1800s where people have actually witnessed African Americans.
And there's a lot of that in this book.
There's a lot of
There's
that
a lot of
in
those
this book.
references in this.
And I think, and he devoured things. And he was also a very fluent writer. I mean, I don't think he ever did what most people now do, you know, on the computer. You kind of procrastinate and
Well, it
try to
amazed
polish
me.
it. He just came out of his head in perfect form. And
He was a hand, you know, the fact that he could do an index without a computer, and indexes are hard even with computers, because what I was, in putting this book together, a large amount of the funding went to creating an index for the book, because most researchers are going to go straight to that index, and that's what you really need. And so I got two very good, this couple, a man and a woman in Denton, who were like former presidents of the Indexing Association, to index this book. But Paul gave the basis of it. I had this one person, sadly, Steve Cook, who passed away, who helped scan and make sense and retype a lot of Paul's and Mac's notes. But, you know, there was one document where Paul just had his list of names. He had everything that he wanted to do. Of course, they were indexed to pages that weren't ultimately the manuscript, but he gave a great guide for doing it. I mean, he was a very tireless kind of scholar. And he was the kind of person who, unlike Mac, liked to engage with people. He liked the exchange of ideas. He liked the idea of bringing knowledge forward. He had that kind of acumen. I mean, a lot of people who study blues are hoarders. Paul clearly kept track of his own research, but he was the kind of person that if you called him on the phone or you wanted to meet with him, he'd sit and talk to you and do his best to help you with whatever you were doing.
Was Paul a student of American history at all? And did he talk with you about it? And what was his understanding of slavery and the position of black people?
Well, there's a lot in this book about slavery. There wasn't, you know, he was a self-taught student of American history. His background, as Chris said, he taught at Oxford Brookes University. He taught the history of vernacular architecture. One of his major books, which he did with his wife Val, was a 1,000,000-word encyclopedia of the vernacular architecture of the world. So he was a thorough researcher, and he understood as best he could from the books he would find. You know, unfortunately, a lot of these books that were written in the 1930s and 40s about slavery were not completely accurate. I mean, there are things in this manuscript that are not completely accurate because it's just based on knowledge as they could find it and information as they could find it. One of the most interesting statistics for me in my last book on Texas blues was talking to a cultural geographer, Randolph Campbell, and he wrote a book about slavery in Texas, and he had found statistics that when African Americans newly freed were being registered to vote in Texas in 1867, in East Texas, which was really the epicenter of where Mac and Paul were doing their research. It was the epicenter of blues. More than 200 people in 1867, when asked their place of birth, said Africa, which really puts everything in a different light. I mean, Mac was very interested in Henry Thomas, Ragtime Texas, who recorded quills and who played African-styled music. Blind Lemon Jefferson was, you know, many of his songs are tuned to an open G. And that open G was also the tuning of these African chordophone banjos that were, I'm sure, plentiful in East Texas.
there's one more section I gotta mention that really got me is the total failure of reconstruction. That really hit me in this book because it really gives it to you in a manner that I'd never even thought about, you know, how it affected the lower classes at that time, especially of people who were suddenly put out there into the world on their own, you know, and they had to beat their way, and we're still in great difficulties, but it doesn't only totally apply to only African Americans. I mean, there was always the poor whites too, you know, who had very similar, but they were socially always in a different class, you know. It's this whole world of class that America really doesn't like to talk about, but it simply exists, you know. And I don't know, there's so much in it, especially I've only gotten to the first half of it, which is part 1. I've started on part 2, which is, Paul deals a lot with the African leftovers, and Bongo Joe features prominently in that. And because he was strictly an improviser who would sing in front of an audience and make up songs on the spot, literally, and which is something that has disappeared. Anyway, it's an amazing book, that's all I can say.
In the back row there.
Yeah, I interviewed Taj Mahal in 2008, and I asked him about the recycling the blues and other things. Album cover shot where he's positioned with Mississippi John Hurt, and I asked him, you know, why didn't Mississippi John Hurt sound like the rest of the guys in the Mississippi Delta? And he explained to me that, like, John Hurt's family came from northern Louisiana, where you had a high percentage of former slaves that had been brought from Mali and had been distributed along the East Coast with that Piedmont style of blues sound. And I'm just wondering, in the notes in the books, all those people who claimed registry in Africa, was there any other information regarding nations or regions or coastlines back to Africa?
You know, there was an area of East Texas that anecdotally, this isn't in the book, but it's through my own research that I did in Senegal, there was an area of Texas, in East Texas, that was called Little Senegal. And, you know, I think that Texas was more complex because during the Civil War, in which Texas was not actively engaged, clearly Texas had its sympathies for the Confederacy. And, you know, there were many Confederate soldiers that came out of Texas. But slaveholders from other places in the South brought their slaves, if possible, to Texas for safekeeping. Because when the Confederacy won the Civil War, they could come back and get them. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And so the population in Texas, first of all, the African American population is much more scattered and dispersed, less concentrated than you find in northern Louisiana or in the Mississippi Delta, where there's a very dense population. So it's difficult to make certain generalities about that, but you know, I definitely agree with what you're saying, that, you know, the different regional blues sounds. It's not the blues was invented on a plantation somewhere in Mississippi. It's the fact that blues developed under a larger kind of social, cultural, economic, political context. It was a response that newly freed African Americans had to the world in which they were living. And clearly these regional styles arise from African Americans having their roots in different parts of Africa. Additionally, what this book kind of brings forth is they very much believed in the idea of greater Texas, that it wasn't just a Texas music, it was greater Texas. It included Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and parts of Texas. So it's much more complex. And so it sheds a lot of light on that, and plus Paul had done a lot of work in Africa. And some of my research really followed up on his, and he was studying these chordophone instruments, which are the roots of the American banjo.
I had just a question. Do you see any relationship between Paul's interest in vernacular architecture and his interest in the blues that is a specific thing? I mean, generally, I can kind of imagine.
Oh, definitely.
Yes.
I mean, it's definitely the case. Paul, they were both at the aspects of vernacular culture. And I think that Paul, you know, as he got more deeply into it, I mean, the cover of the book is a photograph of Paul's that I liked a lot and thought kind of, but it wasn't a picture of a blues singer, it was a picture of an old hotel, you know, that was serviced, you know, African Americans. So I think that, you know, Paul, when he was traveling around, I think was paying attention to the housing as much as anything else and the vernacular architecture, and it definitely connected for him. And that's really what gave his writing, I think, the breadth that it had. You know, to get back to what Chris was saying, in the books he collected, you know, he was someone who wanted to put things into a bigger context. And that's really was in part, the roots of where he and Mack kind of started to split apart. Because Paul wanted to interpret this, you know, what people were saying. And he wanted to see it in a bigger picture. And Mack didn't agree always with his interpretations. And there, you know, he was constantly trying to see, you know, the music in context as best he could, but, you know, his knowledge of it was ultimately limited. He couldn't travel constantly in the American South or in Texas. He needed Mack. They needed each other. And it's too bad they couldn't finally come back together. But they set a task for themselves that was almost insurmountable, because they were really committed to the idea that perhaps the earliest forms of blues emerged in Texas. And that's partly what they were after through this songster tradition and through, you know, just the numbers of people they were interviewing.
And to me, some of the best parts are actually, there's a lot of direct quotes from people as they interview them and the way they say it. I think that to me was really one of the most important parts to it, because so often books are simply written about what people heard. This comes from the horse's mouth directly, the way these people express themselves. And I found that a really, really major, major asset to this book. And also they were able to dig into, you know, during the 30s when the Library of Congress or whoever it was, they made all these interviews with former slaves about the last living people, you know, and they quote many of them exactly. Just what they said, that was taken down, you know, it was recorded. And not just somebody saying, well, this is what they talked about, you know. And it's, to me, that's really powerful stuff, the way people express themselves.
Could you tell us a little about the sort of end of your relationship with Mack? And I'm curious, and you may address this in the book. But what is your relationship to Mack's, his family, Ben, and in turn, I mean, everybody I'm sure has the ongoing curiosity of what's wound up happening with his.
Both Kip and I wanted to honor the best of their relationship, and what we did was we made sure that Mack's presence was fully documented in the book. And Paul, I'm sure, intended to do that, but we had to discover a lot of where these quotations came from and who he was doing interviews with and when they were being done. And there was a lot of reading of letters and notes. And when, you know, Mack died, and there was, well, I didn't have a legal obligation to his family. His daughter came forth, and they wanted to see the manuscript. Now, that was a little, after thousands of dollars and years of work, it was a little hard to want to show it to them, because once I gave them the manuscript, they, you know, like Paul, had the right to do whatever they wanted with it if they wanted to do so. But I wanted to take the high road, and I didn't want this book to be published with any acrimony to Mack's family. I could tell that his daughter was somewhat estranged. I don't know how involved she was. I mean, Mack was very devoted to his wife, Mary. You know, a lot of the letters are in that between them, they were talking about, Mack's talking about Mary, Paul's talking about Val and the importance of their wives and their family. And Mack had a daughter, Val and Paul never had children. And so I agreed to let them take the manuscript for a month and go through it. And she finally, you know, wrote back through her attorney that she would not object to it being published. So, you know, I mean, from that standpoint, I wanted to do the ethical thing. I had no legal obligation to do that, but I felt like, you know, the feud had to end somewhere. And I don't know what's happening to Mack's papers. I mean, she seems very diligent. Her husband seems, you know, very interested in blues. And, you know, it came out later that they had read other books of mine. And so they were kind of aware of what I'd done. And, you know, I hope that ends up in a good place. I mean, accessibility is a lot. But in Paul's case, all these papers and letters and everything will end up at Oxford Brookes University, because that's where he chose to place them. I mean, Dougie and I had talked to him about putting it in a collection in the United States, in the Library of Congress or someplace else, that people would have more easy access to them. But this is what Paul decided. Pardon?
Would they have more easy access to it?
I'm sorry?
Would they have more easy access to it at the Library of Congress?
Well, you know, in today's Library of Congress, maybe it's a little more tough, but
Yes.
because, you know, the fact is that, you know, there's no evidence of signed releases with the people they interviewed. That's a question I can't answer. I'm only presenting what was presented to me, which was their interpretive work. So when it comes down to being able to copyright, research in its raw form can't be copywritten. These are facts. Interpretations can be copyrighted. And so the way in which Paul and I structured even our agreement, even with Mack saying he didn't want to be part of it, was that he gets half, you know, of probably nothing that will ultimately, this will generate in royalties. But I mean, he gets half of Paul's share in terms of, and you know, they did this together, they get 50%. So the idea was to create a structure that was fair. I mean, for Kip and I, we realized we were taking this on, and this was, you know, we've made a career in part doing this kind of work. It was great to just give it to the field, give it back. And that's was our big for us, because it was very hard to do this, to pull this all together. But we felt like this is what we wanted to give to the blues field, because they've been waiting for it for a long time. And, you know, and it's been greatly appreciated in that way. And it's great that all of you turned out to listen to me and Chris ramble on.
And it also deals, really interesting enough, with all the other outside influences that were affecting the African American performers. For example, it deals a good bit with the Mexican influence, especially, you know, when Lonnie Johnson recorded in San Antonio. He was so impressed by the bajo sextos, these 12-string guitars, that they all started to use down there. And it's amazing. And of course, the blues singers always talk about this open tuning, you know, which apparently they learned. And then the early guys, the early white guys, I'll never forget about when Bob Pinson and I drove to Fort Worth in 1960. He found out where Bob Wills' first guitar player was, and we interviewed him. And to me, one of the most interesting records that I loved by the Bob Wills Band was called Swing Blues No. 1. And I asked the guy, how did you learn these lyrics? Like, I walked from Dallas clear into Wichita Fall. If I don't find my baby, it won't be no walk at all. And he said, well, we just went to the furniture store and listened to them N records. That's how they heard it. That's how they, and then they made it their own. You know?
They made it their own. They took
Correct.
that line from Blind Lemon Jefferson and they made it theirs.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there any thought to trying to work to fill the gaps in the book? Maybe, you know, correct some of the errors that are in the book?
I think that's, I'm hoping there will be a graduate student somewhere who will say, I want to do this as my doctoral dissertation. And I will say, great. I'll be glad to talk to you. It isn't, for me, it'll never happen. But for someone else, it will, because I think this book people will ponder over for decades.
Of course, there's another question that comes up because, as we said, Mack McCormick was a frustrated playwright, and I think some of the things that he sort of came up with may well not be totally based on fact. I have no proof of this, but, he found out, for example, that he had interviewed this mysterious duo that made one Paramount Records, these two women, what were their names?
Gishi Wiley and
L.B. Thomas.
L.B. Thomas and
Thomas
Gishi Thomas and Gishi
Yeah.
Wiley.
And of course, somebody came from New York and got into his archives and stole that information from him, and I'm sure he was totally peed off.
Well, that article, it was the cover story of one of the,
Of the
New York Times Sunday
yeah.
magazine. But that was complicated, because I was interviewed heavily for that article, though
see.
nothing I said ever made it into the article. And then I realized what the writer was doing was he was basically using me to substantiate the fact that this existed in another form. So it wasn't completely private. So, I mean, I don't know, but the fact is that I talked to him for 2 days about this, and the most information that exists about those two singers is in this book. And I wouldn't provide him the manuscript, but I did in fact tell him that yes, this discussion exists, and some of these field notes of Max went into it. Now, he went a lot further to find out about these two women. It was an excellent article in a lot of respects, but the fact is that, it was, for me, it crossed a line. And that's where, the research and the family, the point that you just made, that was his daughter Susanna's big worry, was that the material was being ripped off from her father. He'd never made any money off this. And, he lived very meagerly and didn't, he wasn't financially successful. He struggled to make ends meet. And the most valuable possession was what he knew and what he had. And sadly, I'm sure some of it is kind of deteriorated. There's this great Ibsen play, Rajma's Home. I don't know if any of you have ever read it, but it's about this man who keeps his treasures locked up in this box, and he's knows this is what's most valuable in his life. And at the end of his life, he decides that he's going to open his jewels. And he opens the box, and it's all turned to dust.
Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. If the whiskey don't get you, the women must. Okay.
Copies are available. Authors are here for signing. Thank you so much for coming. This has been a great evening.
And I wanted to be in touch with you. I have a lot of questions, and I'd like to continue this conversation, the lives of these folks. And
I'd love to hear other people, if you grew up in that culture.
Yeah, well, not so much that, but I was born into segregation. So.
I'm good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I'm gonna contact you. Okay. I'm gonna come by. All right. See you. Okay. Thanks so much for the work.
You.
Okay, man. Hey, you got your fast. I will take you back.